The morning light of Zephyra 4 shimmered faintly through the translucent walls of the Galactic Academy's survival dome, painting long blue streaks across the metallic floor. Inside, 22 cadets from 12 different star systems stood in uneasy silence, each clutching their personal datapad and wearing the standard-issue breathing collar that monitored atmospheric conditions. The air inside the dome carried a heavy tang of minerals and ozone, a scent that made most off-worlders uncomfortable. Among them stood one human, Lieutenant Aaron Cole, his expression calm, his eyes observant. He had already noticed that the humidity levels were higher than usual and that the instructor's gaze lingered on the environmental control console for far too long. Something was about to happen. The lead instructor, a tall, crystalline being named Serath, stepped forward, his voice resonating through the comm system like glass striking stone. "Cadets," he began, "today's trial will test your ability to adapt under unexpected atmospheric failure. You will receive no external supplies. The air you breathe now will not last long. Your goal is simple: survive." The dome sealed shut with a hiss, and the oxygen indicators on the walls began to blink from green to amber. A murmur rippled through the group. A reptilian cadet from the Thrin Empire hissed nervously and adjusted his collar. A pair of avian students whispered rapidly, their feathers puffing in unease. Aaron remained still, watching the blinking indicators. He knew this was no ordinary simulation. The Academy's trials were infamous across the galaxy for pushing cadets to the edge of their limits, physically, mentally, and morally. Some said the instructors designed them not to be passed, but to expose the soul beneath the uniform. Minutes passed, and the air began to grow heavy. The first to panic was a young amphibian from Karith, who stumbled backward, clutching her chest. Her gills flared desperately as she gasped for oxygen. Another cadet cursed and ran to the door, pounding on it with his fists, shouting that the experiment had gone too far. But no response came. The observation deck above was silent, the instructor's silhouette still and distant behind the glass. Aaron exhaled slowly, feeling the slight tightening in his lungs. He had been in worse situations before. On Mars Station Delta, when an explosion in the oxygen plant had left him and 4 others trapped underground for 2 days. He had learned back then that panic consumed oxygen faster than anything else. He closed his eyes for a brief second and counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. Slow. Controlled. The others had begun to argue, their voices rising with every minute, their movements growing frantic. He walked a few steps away from the crowd, scanning the dome with a soldier's precision. The environment was designed to mimic a humid swamp region on Zephyra's equatorial belt. Artificial fog clung to the corners of the dome, and a cluster of strange mosses grew near a shallow pool of recycled water. Overhead, the ventilation shafts emitted a faint hum, still circulating what little breathable air remained. It wasn't much, but it was something. Aaron crouched near the moss, brushing his fingers across it. It was thick, almost sponge-like, and exuded a faint, earthy scent. He recognized it from the Academy's biology database, Zephyrian moss, known for its ability to absorb carbon dioxide and release trace amounts of oxygen when exposed to heat. Not much, but maybe enough to matter. He glanced back at the group. The reptilian cadet was now arguing with an insectoid who insisted the test was rigged. Several others were already showing signs of oxygen deprivation, shallow breathing, trembling hands, unfocused eyes. He could feel the same symptoms beginning to creep up on him, but he forced himself to remain steady. He needed information before taking action. He made his way toward the central console, where the oxygen levels were displayed as flickering holographic bars. The numbers had dropped from 21% to 16% in under 10 minutes. That rate of decline was too fast for a simple simulation. The instructors had deliberately cut the oxygen supply almost completely. Above him, behind the reinforced glass of the observation deck, Serath observed the group silently. Another instructor, a small, copper-skinned humanoid, muttered something into the intercom, but the sound was muted. Aaron could feel their eyes on him. They wanted to see how the only human in the group would handle it. Humans, after all, were still considered the Death Worlders, the species from a planet so hostile that their survival instincts were almost legendary. Yet reputation alone would not save him here. He returned to the moss patch, kneeling beside it as he began to gather a few clumps. The texture was damp and resilient, clinging to his gloves. He placed them in a small utility pouch and looked around for more usable materials. Near the edge of the pool, he noticed fine ash residue, most likely from the energy drills conducted the previous day when the cadets had practiced emergency fire containment. It was mixed with bits of charred debris. Ash was known for its absorption properties. Perhaps it could trap impurities if combined with the moss. He filed the thought away for later. The hum of the ventilation system weakened, and the silence grew heavier. Breathing became an effort now. Several cadets had collapsed against the walls, their limbs trembling. A few more were shouting for the instructors to stop the test, their voices cracking. The dome's transparent ceiling glowed faintly, reflecting the terrified faces of those inside. Aaron walked among them, checking pulses where he could. He found the amphibian girl unconscious but breathing faintly. He propped her up against a wall, adjusting her collar to keep her airway clear. "Stay calm," he muttered under his breath, not for her but for himself. His voice was low, steady, as if speaking it aloud could anchor his thoughts. Calm is air. Panic is death. He thought about how humans had always adapted to scarcity, on burning deserts, frozen poles, and even the vacuum of space. He remembered his father's words from his early survival training. Air, water, fire, shelter, in that order, son. Lose air, you lose time to think. He took another slow breath and forced his body to move methodically. He began to collect fabric scraps from the cadets' discarded packs, strips torn from training uniforms, old maintenance cloths, anything that could serve a purpose. The others barely noticed him now. From the control deck, Sarath leaned closer to the glass, intrigued. The human wasn't panicking, nor was he trying to break free. He was collecting, analyzing, working, while the rest devolved into chaos. This was precisely the kind of response the test was designed to reveal. The Academy had long debated whether humans truly possessed the adaptability the legends claimed, or if it was merely myth born from ancient wars and exaggerated reports. As the oxygen dropped to 13%, Aaron's vision began to blur at the edges. His temples pulsed painfully, and each breath felt heavier than the last. Still, he refused to slow down. He tied the scraps of fabric together, securing them near the moss and ash pile, sketching a mental plan for a makeshift filter. His mind worked on autopilot, connecting fragments of knowledge, filtration layers, particulate trapping, heat-driven reactions. It wasn't enough yet, but the foundation was there. In the corner of the dome, the reptilian cadet fell unconscious. Another alien screamed. Aaron knew that soon he would be the only one left awake. He turned his eyes upward toward the observation deck, locking his gaze on the instructors behind the glass. For a brief moment, their reflections flickered, and he could almost sense surprise. He straightened his posture, drawing one more deliberate breath, shallow but steady. The test had truly begun now, not against the lack of oxygen, but against the limits of fear. The dome had become a silent battlefield, and Aaron understood that survival was not about outlasting the others. It was about thinking faster than the air could run out. He clenched his fists and whispered a quiet promise into the thickening haze. "You want to see human adaptation?" he said to the invisible watchers. "Then you'll see it." As the last of the light faded from the dome's ceiling, he crouched back beside the moss and the ash, his hands steady despite the growing dizziness. Around him, the world seemed to dim into slow motion. The sound of struggling breaths, the flicker of failing lights, the faint hum of the dying ventilation system. But inside his mind, everything was sharp, clear, and alive. He already knew that somewhere in this damp, suffocating dome, the solution was waiting to be built. and he was determined to find it before his next breath became his last. The oxygen had thinned to the point where every inhalation felt like dragging air through a clogged filter. The hum of the dome's systems had nearly faded, leaving behind a tense silence broken only by shallow breathing and occasional gasps. The once orderly group of cadets had dissolved into fragments, some slumped against the walls, others stumbling blindly as the edges of consciousness slipped away. The faint blue light that filtered through the dome made their faces ghostly, accentuating fear in every trembling movement. Aaron forced his aching lungs to keep working, pacing himself with deliberate rhythm. He had collected what materials he could, moss, ash, strips of fabric, but he knew that without a plan, all of it meant nothing. His thoughts began to feel sluggish, like trying to think through syrup, yet his training demanded focus. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple, grounding himself in the sharp pulse of pain. It reminded him that he was still alive. The reptilian cadet who had collapsed earlier began to convulse. Aaron rushed to him, kneeling beside his limp form. The alien's scaled chest heaved erratically. Aaron adjusted his posture to open his airway, but it was useless. His body was rejecting the thin air. The dome's display showed oxygen levels at 12%. A species adapted to high-density atmospheres like Thrin couldn't survive much longer at this level. Aaron's jaw tightened. The instructors had crossed the line between simulation and cruelty. He looked up at the observation deck, seeing only unmoving silhouettes behind the darkened glass. He muttered under his breath, "You want to see what happens when everything breaks? You'll get your show." A clattering sound broke his focus. Across the dome, an insectoid cadet had ripped off one of the air vent panels in a desperate attempt to find clean air. A puff of dust and burnt metal filled the space instead, triggering a wave of coughing. Another cadet screamed for help, his voice cracking into panic. Someone shoved someone else, and within seconds, the noise of chaos swelled again. The survival trial had become an open descent into hysteria. Aaron took several unsteady steps toward the center, steadying himself against a pillar. His eyes scanned the environment. The dome's inner walls were lined with condensation. That meant humidity, water vapor. Water could carry suspended particles, but more importantly, it could help stabilize temperature and possibly carry trace oxygen. He remembered that the dome's climate system recycled everything, including exhaled carbon dioxide. The moss patches near the recycler might still be interacting with it. There was logic hidden beneath the chaos. He just had to find it before his mind shut down. He stumbled back toward the moss cluster. His hands trembled as he tore another patch free, feeling its spongy texture. He noticed that parts of it were faintly glowing, bioluminescence triggered by energy absorption. That glow meant metabolic activity, which in turn meant it was still photosynthesizing, albeit weakly under the artificial light. The realization sparked something within him. Even if the instructors had cut oxygen supply, the dome's self-contained ecosystem couldn't be completely neutralized. There was life still breathing within the system, no matter how faintly. He sat down heavily beside the pool, dragging the ash pile closer. The ash was gray-black and fine, still carrying traces of carbon from burnt organic matter. He tested its texture between his fingers, powdery, porous. It could trap impurities like soot and volatile particles. He thought of the filtration units on early Mars outposts, primitive but functional, using similar layering principles. He needed to replicate that concept here, by hand, before his own lungs gave up. While he worked, he could hear the others losing themselves. A female avian cadet began to sob hysterically, her claws scraping against the glass wall as she cried out for the instructors to end the trial. Another cadet had curled up near the floor, whispering nonsense in a delirious loop. The collective despair pressed in on him like the weight of gravity itself. He could feel its pull, that primal instinct whispering to give up. But he had trained too long to surrender to that voice. His fingers worked mechanically, weaving the scraps of fabric into a rough mesh. He layered ash between the folds, using fragments of broken maintenance tape to hold it together. He soaked the edges in the pool's damp residue, sealing them into a pliable mold. It looked crude, like something built by a desperate scavenger, but it was the only thing standing between him and suffocation. He pressed a piece of the moss into the center, letting it cling naturally to the fabric's wet fibers. The smell of earth and metal mixed in the air, a strange comfort. When he lifted his head, the dome seemed to sway. His vision dimmed for a heartbeat, and a cold rush of panic nearly overtook him. He forced his breathing back into rhythm, shallow but steady. He focused on the tactile sensations, the texture of the moss, the grit of the ash, the dampness of the cloth, each a reminder that his hands still obeyed him. He held the half-formed filter close to his face, inhaled experimentally through it. The air that reached his lungs was faintly cooler, slightly cleaner, not perfect, but better. A fragile thread of hope flickered in his chest. He kept refining the structure, alternating layers of ash and fabric while pressing the moss into the center. Each movement became slower, heavier, as the oxygen depletion deepened. Sweat clung to his forehead. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the chaos around him. He imagined the instructors watching, calculating survival probabilities, perhaps betting among themselves on who would last longest. He didn't care. His focus narrowed to the small creation forming in his hands. As he worked, he glanced at the ventilation shaft that the insectoid had torn open. The internal tubing was still faintly vibrating, proof that some air still circulated through the system, though it was barely enough to sustain anyone. If he could redirect it through his filter, he might amplify the clean air's effect. He crawled toward the shaft, dragging his makeshift filter and a broken length of conduit pipe he had found earlier. The pipe fit roughly into the vent's mouth. He pressed the filter over its opening and sealed it, using the resin streaks that leaked from the dome wall joints. The resin hardened quickly, forming a rough barrier. It wasn't airtight, but it would do. The moment he finished, he felt a faint, cool stream brush his cheek. Air, thin but breathable, was flowing through. He bent down and inhaled through the pipe. The taste of ash and metal still lingered, but underneath it was something cleaner, sharper. His body reacted instinctively, lungs expanding in relief. The dizziness receded slightly. For the first time since the trial began, he could think clearly. He looked around at the others. The reptilian cadet was motionless, but the avian was still conscious, barely. She looked at him with blurred eyes, confusion and fear mixing in her gaze. Without hesitating, he gestured for her to crawl closer. She hesitated, then obeyed, clutching her chest. He held the pipe toward her, signaling for her to breathe from it. When she did, her body jerked in surprise at the rush of air. Her feathers shivered as her breathing stabilized slightly. She looked at him as if he were some kind of miracle. He didn't speak. There was no energy left for words. The dome had fallen into eerie half-darkness now, lit only by the faint bioluminescence of the moss and the emergency lights pulsing red along the upper walls. The colors painted surreal patterns over the unconscious cadets, sprawled across the floor. Aaron adjusted the pipe's position, angling it so that the small pocket of breathable air could reach others nearby. He didn't know how long it would last, but it was something. A fragile victory against an impossible trial. Above, unseen by those within, the instructors watched in absolute silence. The copper-skinned observer muttered to Sarath, "He's creating a primitive scrubber, without access to energy cells." Sarath's crystalline form refracted the faint light as he replied, "Yes, and he's stabilizing others. The test was meant to isolate, not unite." The copper one frowned. "Perhaps isolation is not what humans understand best." Sarath tilted his head slightly. "No. They understand survival through connection." Below, Aaron pressed his back against the wall, eyes half closed. Every breath was an effort, but each one now carried a trace of renewal. His mind drifted between exhaustion and clarity. He knew he had bought himself, and maybe a few others, a little more time. The test was far from over, but in that suffocating dome filled with panic and despair, a single human had managed to reclaim what everyone else had already lost: the will to think. Somewhere deep in the walls, the oxygen level sensors flickered faintly as the dome's internal pressure adjusted. The readings were still dropping, but the pattern had changed, stabilizing in the section where Aaron's filter now sat. The system had begun to recognize his improvised intervention. The human, unknowingly, was altering the dome's own survival parameters through instinct and sheer willpower. He exhaled slowly, leaning his head back, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. The others might still fall, the trial might still grow harsher, but he had already proven something the instructors had not anticipated: that human desperation, when tempered with intelligence, could turn panic into invention. And as the dome slipped deeper into quiet, that invention kept breathing softly through the pipe, a rhythmic whisper of defiance against the void. The dome had fallen into an uneasy stillness, broken only by the faint hum of air moving through Aaron's improvised filter. The bluish fog of Zephyra 4's artificial atmosphere clung low to the ground, curling around the unconscious forms of cadets scattered across the metallic floor. The faint light from the moss patches reflected in the thin layer of condensation, giving the scene an otherworldly glow. Aaron sat near the wall, exhausted but focused, watching the slow rhythm of the avian cadets breathing beside him. She was alive, barely, but alive nonetheless. That was proof that his design worked, even if imperfectly. He forced himself to stand, legs trembling under the strain. The faint oxygen coming from the filter wasn't enough to sustain everyone. The air had stabilized just enough to prevent death, but not enough for clear thinking or movement. His pulse pounded in his temples, his lungs heavy as if he were breathing through fabric soaked in mud. Yet his mind refused to slow down. Each flicker of air through the vent gave him more data: how much resistance the layers created, how efficiently the moss absorbed the stale carbon dioxide. He could feel that it needed improvement, refinement, scaling. He approached the small vent where he had attached his makeshift filter, inspecting it closely. The resin seal had hardened, holding the layers firmly in place. The faint draft of filtered air pulsed through in waves. He touched the edge and felt slight moisture forming. That meant the moss inside was reacting. It was alive and converting gases, even if inefficiently. He had to optimize it. He tore off another strip of fabric from his sleeve and wiped his forehead, feeling the fine tremor in his hands. The air was running out faster than he could think. Every movement now was a calculation between risk and breath. Across the room, a low groan broke the silence. One of the insectoid cadets stirred, blinking sluggishly. Aaron turned toward him and saw confusion flicker in his multi-lensed eyes. The alien tried to rise but fell again, his limbs twitching weakly. Aaron crouched beside him, resting a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Easy," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The insectoid's mandibles clicked faintly in acknowledgement, his breath shallow but stabilizing. The human realized that if he could extend his filter's reach, more of the cadets might recover. He moved to the other end of the dome, gathering discarded materials. Broken maintenance tubing, flexible cables, scraps of mesh from the control panels, all potential conduits. His mind operated in sequences now: airflow, absorption, dispersion. He dragged a metal pipe to the vent and attached it as an extension. The pipe rattled when he secured it, amplifying the faint hiss of air like a whisper echoing through an empty room. He watched the airflow pattern and realized the pressure difference between the dome's zones could distribute oxygen if directed correctly. If he could create a network of small vents linked through the same filter, he could spread breathable air throughout the chamber. Working with numb fingers, he tore more moss from the wall and layered it between ash and fabric, repeating the same structure as before. This time, he added damp ash from the condensation pool to increase the surface area. The air tasted metallic in his mouth as he worked, the dryness burning his throat. He could feel the lack of oxygen turning his thoughts hazy, but he pushed through, holding on to the memory of the first breath of clean air he had created. He used it like a lifeline. When the structure was complete, he fitted it into a secondary vent pipe and sealed it using melted resin from the dome's wiring. The heat singed his fingers, leaving small blisters, but he ignored the pain. The smell of burnt resin filled the air, sharp and acidic. He connected the pipe to the first vent and angled it across the dome floor, where several cadets lay motionless. He watched the faint movement of fog near the pipe's mouth, air displacement. Slowly, the haze began to shift, indicating circulation. The filtered oxygen was spreading. Minutes passed like hours. The first to stir was the amphibian cadet he had stabilized earlier. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and confused. She took a shallow breath and then another, deeper one. Her gills twitched faintly as she inhaled the cleaner air. Aaron's chest tightened with relief. One by one, a few others began to move, weak but alive. He wasn't saving them in the conventional sense. He was buying them time. But that was all survival ever was, buying seconds until the next idea struck. Above the dome, the instructors watched in rapt attention. The copper-skinned observer leaned forward, his eyes wide. "He's expanding the system," he whispered. "He's replicating environmental filtration without power or tools." Sarath, composed and unreadable, replied, "He's not just surviving, he's rebuilding the ecosystem." Aaron, unaware of the observer's astonishment, continued his work with mechanical determination. His thoughts were now stripped of everything except function. Input, reaction, output. He reinforced the filter structure with an extra layer of ash, adding density to trap more impurities. He ran his hand along the surface of the moss, feeling its faint pulse of life. The moisture it produced condensed along the pipe's edges, creating a natural humidity barrier. The system was evolving on its own, guided by instinct and necessity. He turned his gaze toward the unconscious cadets still lying in the shadows. The avian girl stirred again and opened her eyes. She watched him silently, her expression somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. Her breathing was shallow but rhythmic. Aaron gave her a faint nod before returning to the vent. His thoughts were beginning to blur again, his body running on reserves. The air had improved, but not enough to sustain the full group. He needed more moss. He crossed the dome toward the far corner, where denser patches grew near the recycler unit. The path was littered with collapsed bodies, fragments of gear, and traces of spilled liquid that shimmered faintly under the emergency lights. The air was thickest there, nearly unbreathable. His chest burned with every step. He reached the wall and began scraping the moss free with his hands, ignoring the cuts forming along his knuckles. The moss clung stubbornly, its roots intertwined with the metal surface, as if resisting removal. He tore at it until he had gathered enough, then staggered back toward the central filter. As he reassembled the layers, his vision flickered at the edges. The world tilted slightly, colors bleeding together. He felt the raw ache of exhaustion crawling through every muscle. He had to finish before his body gave out. He secured the new moss onto the secondary vent and sealed the gaps with damp fabric, pressing it firmly until the airflow steadied again. When the cool draft brushed against his face, he felt a rush of relief so intense it almost brought him to tears. The dome had grown quieter now. The earlier panic had subsided into weak murmurs and shallow breaths. The few who were conscious watched him in silence, too drained to speak. He caught glimpses of gratitude in their eyes, though most couldn't comprehend what he was doing. To them, the human was moving like an automaton, collecting strange materials and binding them together into something that inexplicably gave life. To him, it was the most natural response in the world, to build, to adapt, to refuse to die. From the observation deck, Sarath finally spoke again. "He found balance," he said quietly. "Where others saw isolation, he created a system." The copper-skinned instructor replied softly, "It's not just survival instinct. It's empathy guiding ingenuity. He doesn't build only for himself. Sarath's crystalline face reflected the faint light as he murmured, "Perhaps that is the human difference." Down below, Aaron slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged but steady. The filters hummed faintly, releasing slow, pulsing drafts of oxygen-rich air. The fog near the floor began to lift slightly, revealing the outlines of the cadets' bodies. He knew it wasn't over. The oxygen could run out again, or the moss could die if the conditions shifted. But for now, the balance held. He had turned desperation into design. He closed his eyes for a moment, his head resting back against the cold metal. His thoughts drifted to the simplicity of the process, the cycle of exchange between breath and earth, carbon and life. He realized that survival wasn't about resisting nature but working with it, shaping it through understanding rather than domination. The same principle that had kept humanity alive on hostile worlds was alive here too, in the silence of this dome, where a man and a handful of alien cadets clung to existence on nothing but moss, ash, and willpower. When he opened his eyes again, the faint light of Zephyr's artificial dawn filtered through the dome ceiling. The oxygen level indicators flickered from red to amber, a fragile sign of improvement. He allowed himself one shallow, trembling laugh. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was proof. The instructors might have turned off the air, but he had built his own. He had built life from the decay around him. The weak glow from the moss filters pulsed through the half-lit dome like faint heartbeats, each wave of air whispering through the vents with a soft, rhythmic sigh. Aaron sat in silence for several minutes, his back pressed against the cool metal wall, eyes half closed as he fought the exhaustion creeping through his veins. His creation was working, but the effort had drained every ounce of energy from his body. Still, as he listened to the faint breaths returning to those who had nearly lost consciousness, a quiet determination ignited again in his chest. The system he had built had proven itself, but it wasn't enough. Too many still lay motionless across the floor, and the oxygen distribution remained uneven. He couldn't rest yet. He forced himself to stand. The air was marginally easier to breathe now, though each inhalation still burned his lungs like thin smoke. The avian cadet stirred again beside him, her eyes following his movements with sluggish awareness. She made a faint sound, a whisper that barely resembled speech, but he understood the meaning behind it. What now? He gave her a small nod and pressed his hand briefly to his chest, signaling that he would take care of it. Then he turned back toward the filter network. The air flow through the pipes had stabilized near the center of the dome, but the outer perimeter remained stagnant. The moss there had begun to wither, its faint luminescence fading under the strain of overuse. He needed to circulate air evenly across the dome, or the revived cadets would start losing consciousness again. He crouched beside the vent, tracing the flow of condensation along the pipe. Moisture gathered near the seams, dripping steadily to the floor. That meant pressure imbalance, too much air in one section, too little in another. He moved along the line, inspecting every connection. His vision blurred in and out, but his hands kept working, guided more by instinct than sight. He adjusted the resin seals, widening some openings and narrowing others, creating a crude balance of flow. He had done similar work once before, during his service on a damaged transport freighter orbiting Titan, when the air filtration units had ruptured after a hull breach. The same principles applied here, though now he had no tools, no backup, and no time. Behind him, faint sounds of life began to stir. The insectoid cadet who had collapsed earlier twitched his limbs, his segmented eyes glimmering faintly. Another alien, a thin, feline-like humanoid, groaned softly as she rolled onto her side. The sound was weak, but unmistakable. Breathing. Aaron turned his head slightly, his chest tightening with relief. The system was expanding its reach. The improvised network was saving them, slowly pulling the dome back from the edge of death. He moved to the recycler unit near the wall, hoping to reroute residual air through the same filter system. The machinery hummed weakly, a low mechanical pulse resonating through the floor. It was still functional but running on emergency power. He crouched beside it and removed the outer panel, exposing a web of translucent tubes. He had to be careful. One mistake could trigger the dome's failsafe and shut the entire system down. With trembling hands, he disconnected a secondary tube and redirected it toward his filter pipe, using fabric strips to tighten the connection. The suction increased immediately, pulling air through the moss layers faster than before. A faint draft swept through the dome, enough to lift the fog slightly. Aaron's vision cleared just enough for him to see the change. The moss patches across the walls flickered back to life, glowing softly in response to the increased air movement. He felt the faintest breeze against his cheek, cool and damp. It was the sound of survival, fragile and beautiful. He exhaled slowly, letting the moment ground him. The calm didn't last long. A sudden loud thump echoed from the far side of the dome. He spun around and saw one of the cadets, an amphibian, sliding to the floor again. She had regained consciousness earlier but must have stood too quickly. Her chest heaved violently as her body fought to draw air. Aaron stumbled toward her, catching her before she hit the ground. Her skin was cold and clammy, her eyes rolled back. He pressed 2 fingers against her throat, feeling the faint pulse fluttering beneath her skin. She was alive but fading fast. He needed to bring her closer to the vent. He lifted her carefully, her body heavier than it looked, and carried her toward the central area where the airflow was strongest. Every step burned his muscles. His vision dimmed for a second, and he almost lost balance, but he kept moving, dragging one foot after the other. He laid her beside the main pipe, angling her head toward the airstream. After a few moments, her breathing steadied slightly. He watched her chest rise and fall, slow but regular. Relief coursed through him again, but it was quickly replaced by the cold realization that she wasn't the only one in danger. He looked around. The dome floor was still littered with bodies. Some were breathing faintly, others not at all. The filter system worked, but the airflow wasn't reaching every section fast enough. He would have to create portable versions, small filters that could be placed near individuals. His eyes swept across the environment, searching for more materials. He spotted a few intact maintenance gloves near the supply hatch, their synthetic fibers thick enough to hold ash and moss. He grabbed them, filled each with alternating layers of moss and ash, and tied the openings with strips of fabric. The gloves became crude air pouches, miniature filters. He placed one beside the reptilian cadet and gently pressed it near his mouth, then squeezed the glove to push air through. The reptilian's chest moved faintly. Aaron repeated the process for others, crawling between them, checking pulses and adjusting their positions. He ignored his own dizziness, the ringing in his ears, and the dryness cracking his lips. Every breath he gave them felt like one he lost himself, but it didn't matter. The dome was no longer silent. Faint, uneven breathing filled the air once more. Above, Sarath and the other instructors remained silent. The copper-skinned observer leaned forward, awe replacing skepticism. "He's rationing oxygen manually," he said quietly. "He's functioning as a living distribution system." Sarath's crystalline form refracted light across the observation glass, his voice even but tinged with something like respect. "He acts as if survival is a shared equation, not an individual result." Inside the dome, Aaron slumped back against the central pillar, his body shaking from fatigue. His uniform was damp with condensation and sweat, his hair clinging to his forehead. The faint light from the moss painted his skin in green hues, making him look almost alien himself. The avian cadet crawled closer to him, her wings dragging along the floor. She looked at him silently, eyes wide with something like gratitude. He gave a faint nod, his lips too dry to form words. She touched his shoulder briefly, a gesture of acknowledgement, before sitting beside him. The filters hummed softly, creating an irregular rhythm that filled the silence. Aaron's eyes traced the movement of the air currents, the slow dance of mist rising and dispersing. For the first time since the test began, he felt the fragile stability of life returning to the dome. Yet he also knew it wouldn't last forever. The moss would eventually exhaust its capability to regenerate oxygen, and the ash filters would saturate. He had bought them time, not safety. Still, in that moment, as the others began to stir and lift their heads weakly, he allowed himself a brief sense of peace. He had done what none of the others had. He had seen beyond panic, beyond despair, and found a way to turn the smallest fragments of life into salvation. The faint smell of moss and ash hung in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of the dome's recycled atmosphere. It wasn't pleasant, but it was alive, and that was enough. He leaned back, letting his eyes drift upward toward the transparent dome ceiling. The distant stars of Zephyr's night sky shimmered through the mist, cold and indifferent. He wondered if those stars had ever witnessed such fragile defiance before. A group of cadets breathing borrowed air through a human's handmade filter. He smiled faintly, though it hurt to do so. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and pain, he felt a quiet pride not in his ingenuity, but in his refusal to let anyone die. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of air moving through the vents, like a pulse echoing through the walls. He knew the test wasn't over, but the dome had changed. It was no longer a sealed chamber of fear. It was a living system now, imperfect, fragile, and breathing, just like its human creator. The dome remained quiet, except for the slow, rhythmic murmur of filtered air sweeping through Aaron's handmade network. The emergency lights had dimmed to a pale violet glow, painting every surface in muted tones that softened the raw metallic walls. The crisis had not entirely passed. Oxygen remained thin, the air carried a sharp taste of ash, and the moss filters pulsed faintly with the last of their vitality. But life endured. The cadets who had once lain unconscious now breathed weakly, their chests rising and falling in uneven rhythm. The silence that had once symbolized despair now carried an almost sacred stillness. It was the sound of survival. Aaron sat motionless for a long time, his back against the central pillar. His body was drained, his thoughts sluggish, but his mind refused to collapse into rest. He stared at the faint light above, the stars faintly visible through the translucent dome ceiling. The human part of him longed for sleep, yet another part, the part molded by years of discipline, training, and the primal need to endure, remained alert. He listened to the subtle sounds, the whisper of air currents, the soft cough of a cadet waking up, the slow hiss of moisture evaporating near the recycler. Each sound confirmed that his creation still functioned. He knew the moss would soon deplete its photosynthetic capacity. The heat from the recycled lights had begun to dry its edges, turning the once vibrant green patches into dull brown streaks. He had extended their survival far beyond expectation, but nature had limits. The instructors would have to end the test soon, or the entire dome would suffocate once again. He hoped the observers understood that continuing further would mean death for everyone inside. He pushed himself upright and staggered toward the filter vents, inspecting the seals. The resin had cracked in places, weakened by moisture and shifting pressure. He pressed the gaps closed with fabric, sealing them again as best as he could. Each movement cost him a surge of effort. Sweat stung his eyes and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he refused to stop. He had seen too much collapse already. He would not let the system fail while there was still breath left in him. A faint rustle made him turn. The avian cadet had risen on unsteady legs, her wings drooping behind her as she looked around the dome. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, neither spoke. Then she placed her clawed hand over her chest and lowered her head slightly in silent acknowledgement. Aaron nodded faintly in return. It was not gratitude she offered. It was respect, the kind that came not from authority or rank, but from recognition of something elemental, something unspoken between beings who had walked the edge of death and found a way back. She turned toward the nearest unconscious cadet, kneeling beside him and pressing her ear near his mouth. When she confirmed he was breathing, she began to adjust the airflow around him, mimicking the way she had seen Aaron work. Her gestures were clumsy, but they carried purpose. Others who were awake began to stir as well, following her lead. The dome, which had once been filled with chaos and panic, now moved with quiet coordination. The unity of survivors was forming before his eyes, not through command, but through example. Aaron leaned back against the pillar and allowed himself a small exhale of relief. It was happening, the very thing the instructors had never planned for. What had started as a test of isolation and endurance had become an experiment in collective survival. The lesson had shifted from self-preservation to cooperation, and it had been born from the hands of a human who refused to stand alone while others died. High above, behind the observation glass, Sarath watched silently. The crystalline structure of his face refracted the faint light from the dome into hundreds of shimmering fragments. The copper-skinned instructor beside him leaned closer, whispering, "He has stabilized them all. The oxygen levels are climbing again, slowly, but enough." Sarath did not respond immediately. His eyes followed Aaron, watching the way he moved despite exhaustion, his gestures careful and precise. Finally, Sarath said quietly, "End the trial. He has achieved what we could not have foreseen." The command panel flashed once, and with a deep mechanical hum, the dome's sealed vents reopened. A gust of fresh, pure oxygen rushed in, sweeping through the space like a flood of invisible wind. The cadets gasped as the first real air filled their lungs. Some coughed violently, others collapsed in tears of relief. Aaron felt the sudden surge of clean oxygen hit him like fire in his chest. His knees buckled, and he fell against the pillar, inhaling deeply. The world spun for a moment, the overwhelming freshness almost painful after so many hours of deprivation. Above, the lights brightened, shifting from violet to white. The test was over. The dome had come alive again, and with it, the quiet murmur of machines returning to function. The instructors descended through the airlock shortly afterward, their steps echoing sharply in the renewed air. Sarath approached Aaron, his crystalline form shimmering under the restored light. The human tried to stand, but faltered, catching himself on the pillar. Sarath raised one transparent hand slightly, not as a gesture of command, but of acknowledgement. "Lieutenant Aaron Cole," Sarath said, his voice resonating with calm gravity. "The purpose of this trial was to test adaptability under isolation. But what you have demonstrated transcends that. You transformed a sealed death chamber into a living system. You understood what most species forget, that survival is not sustained by tools alone, but by understanding." Aaron said nothing for several seconds. His throat was raw, and his voice emerged as a rasp. "You cut off the oxygen. You wanted to see who would break first." He looked directly into Sarath's multifaceted eyes. "You saw what happens when others panic. You didn't expect a human to build instead of destroy." Sarath inclined his head slightly. "We underestimated you," he admitted, "and perhaps we underestimated humanity." Aaron's gaze drifted past him, toward the group of recovering cadets. The avian girl had begun helping the reptilian cadet to his feet. The insectoid, once near death, now sat upright, his mandibles clicking softly in quiet communication with another survivor. The dome no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a rebirth. He exhaled slowly, his mind finally beginning to accept that the ordeal was truly over. Sarath turned to the others and addressed them all. "Let this trial be recorded not as a test of endurance, but as a lesson in synthesis. The human has reminded us that intellect and empathy are not separate forces. They are survival's twin elements." His gaze returned briefly to Aaron. "You have given this academy a new definition of resilience." Aaron listened without pride or satisfaction. He didn't see what he had done as heroism. To him, it had been instinct, an unshakable impulse to create order out of collapse. He looked at the moss patches on the walls, their fading glow reflecting against the metal. He approached one, touching its brittle surface gently with his fingertips. The plant had given everything it had to sustain life, and now it would wither. A faint smile touched his lips. "Nothing survives alone," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The instructors began escorting the cadets out of the dome one by one. Some of the aliens looked back at Aaron as they passed, offering subtle nods or small gestures of respect. The avian girl paused before leaving, placing her hand briefly over her heart again before stepping through the airlock. When the dome was empty, Aaron remained behind for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around him. He glanced up at the observation glass one final time. Sarath stood there, unmoving, watching him with quiet contemplation. The human met his gaze and gave a faint nod. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his steps unsteady but resolute. The door sealed behind him, leaving the dome in stillness once more. Later, when the Academy's report was published, it would describe the event as the Zephyr 4 survival anomaly. The official summary would speak of unexpected human adaptability, biological improvisation, and the restoration of breathable equilibrium. But among the cadets who had lived through it, no one remembered it as an anomaly. They remembered it as the day a single human refused to let them die. For Aaron, the lesson was simpler and quieter. As he walked through the Academy's sterile corridors, breathing the clean, processed air, he felt neither pride nor triumph. He only felt gratitude for the moss, the ash, the fabric, and the breath that had carried them all through. Survival was not about dominance or strength. It was about seeing life in the smallest things and giving it the chance to keep breathing. And as he stepped outside into Zephyr's twilight, the wind touched his face, cool, steady, and endless. He inhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a moment. The air was abundant now, yet he understood it differently than before. Every breath, he realized, was a fragile miracle, and for the first time, he truly appreciated its weight.